I'm George Marlin, substituting for Steve Malzberg today. And next, our guest is Bob Greco. Bob Greco is the Group Director of the American Petroleum Institute. Mr. Greco, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, George. Happy to be here.
Okay, you've been banging the pots and pans on the Energy Independence and Security Act concerning renewable fuel standards. What do you see are the major flaws of that act?
That's correct, George. Basically, we're dealing with an act that, when it was passed in 2007, was passed in a completely different energy reality than what we have now. Back in 2007, oil imports were increasing, domestic oil production was decreasing, greenhouse gas emissions were going up, and these advanced biofuels were supposedly right around the corner. Every single one of those assumptions has been turned on its head just in the past 6 years. So we're now looking at energy abundance, energy independence, because of increased oil and natural gas production. And the whole purpose of forcing more biofuels into the gasoline and diesel mix is outdated at this point.
Do you think it's just, it continues, it's outdated, I would agree, but do you think it continues because it's just a sop to the farmers?
Well, I think that's where the support is, clearly. When you look at the broad array of interests that want to revisit the renewable fuel standard because of how it affects them, such as the restaurant and poultry produce producers, the farmers who don't farm corn. If you farm cattle or beef or chickens or turkey, it raises your feed costs. Environmental groups are not enamored with corn ethanol because of the potential environmental impacts of increased plantings of corn ethanol. Small engine manufacturers and operators, boats, motorcycles, et cetera, weed whackers are concerned about it because too much ethanol can damage those engines. So it's a broad array of the U.S. economy that feels that this needs to be revisited.
Well, it's interesting. I know a guy on the South Shore of Long Island. He makes his living fixing motors on, motorboats and larger boats. And he said ethanol is absolutely destroying these motors, particularly if they sit around during the winter when it gets cold. It just turns into goop. And he's making a fortune fixing these things, but he says it's been an absolute disaster. Has there been any studies or any, again, banging the pots and pans to point this out, that the destruction it could do to at least boats? What about the automobiles as well? Same problems there?
I think it's a bigger problem, I think, with the small engines, just for the reason you said, because the fuels can sit for months on end. And many of these small engines have an issue with having fuel sit in their tanks for many, many months when it contains ethanol. With automobiles, it's a slightly different issue because every car on the road today was certified to run on up to 10% ethanol, which is primarily the fuel that they see.
Yeah.
So some ethanol is fine with engines in your cars and trucks. The problem is EPA has retroactively decided that if you have a 2001 and newer car, it actually can run on fuels up to 15% ethanol. And you might say, what's another 5%? Well, the problem is every automaker has declined to extend warranty coverage for older vehicles when exposed to that fuel. And if you look at the owner's manuals of those cars, they say it should be operated on up to 10% ethanol. So you've got a real problem with existing automakers, existing engines, to the point where groups like AAA has said that E15 is not a good idea, has not been studied enough, as well as groups like the California Air Resources Board, which is the big regulatory group in California, has said that E15 isn't approved in the state of California, single biggest automotive market. So there are problems with forcing too much ethanol into the fuels, and it puts consumers' engines at risk.
U.S. gasoline demand has declined. Why is that? Because of the prices? Are the liberals finally right, saying, oh, it drives up prices, people use less gas? What is your analysis of that?
Well, that is the other dynamic. In addition to what I mentioned before, we're using less gasoline than we thought we would be using back in 2007. Back in 2007, the government projected increasing growth for the foreseeable future. But what's happened since then are a couple of big factors. One is increased fuel efficiency. Cars are becoming more and more fuel efficient, so they're using less and less gasoline. And we also, unfortunately, seen the results of the recession, which put a damper on gasoline and diesel demand. So the combination of those two factors, and particularly the continuing increase in fuel economy, because of that, the government now projects flat or declining gasoline demand for the foreseeable future. So it's a complete turnaround. Yet the renewable fuel standard requires increasing amounts of ethanol anyways every year through 2022. So pushing more ethanol into fewer and fewer gallons of gasoline is a recipe for trouble.
So can the Obama administration, or liberals in particular, declare victory that their policies have brought down the demand for gas, or is it just because basically it's remained flat in a sense, just as many people are driving as before? I'm missing a point here. Who gets the victory here? And we got about 20 seconds left.
Right now, it's the ethanol and corn growers are getting the victory. It is a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats feel the RFS needs to be revisited. So we're pushing EPA to lower it in the short term, fix it to prevent us from putting fuels in that could harm engines. But in the long term, we need Congress to revisit this outdated act and preferably repeal it once and for all.
Hopefully that's the case. Mr. Greco, I want to thank you for joining our show today. Appreciate it. Hope you can come back again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This is George Marlin subbing for Steve Malzberg on the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax TV. We'll be back in a minute.
The Steve